So let's get this meeting started. Ms. Marcoux, can we start with roll call, please?
Yes. Directors Huang?
Here.
Akbari?
Here.
Sethy?
Here.
Reed? And Gunther.
Let's see. Director Sethy, would you lead in a salute to the flag?
All right. Hand over your heart and follow me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, next item up is public comments. Do we have any members of the public that wish to provide comments on matters of this notice of special meeting? Seeing none, let's move on to consent calendar, please.
Yes, the item 4.1 involves the authorization of change order and resolution accepting completion of the Rubber Dam Number 3 Fishway construction and fabric replacement project. And I am thrilled to be able to convey to the board that the RD3 project is now fully complete and operational.
Can you define what RD3 is?
Certainly. For members of the public that might be here, we receive about 40% of our water supply from the Alameda Creek watershed. We have 2 inflatable rubber dams on Alameda Creek that divert water to Quarry Lakes Park, and we are installing fish ladders so that endangered steelhead may migrate upstream and spawn. And the first of the two fish ladders, rather, has been completed. So this summer we'll be working on the second fish ladder. So once that second one is complete, then Alameda Creek watershed will be fully open for steelhead business once again. First time since the 1970s. And it should be noted for the record that the reason why they can't migrate upstream is not because of district facilities. It is a Corps of Engineers grade control structure, a big concrete structure that is in the way. So our fish ladders will allow the fish to migrate past that structure, as well as the rubber dams when they are deflated. But during migration season, most of the time, when they are inflated, most of the time during migration season, they are deflated and not a barrier to fish passage.
Thank you. With that, do I have a motion for item 4.1?
I'll make a motion to approve item 4.1 under the consent calendar.
I'll second. Directors Akbari?
Aye.
Sethy?
Aye.
And Huang?
Aye. Moving on, item 5, review of fiscal year 2019, 2020, and 2020-2021 preliminary budget.
So we do have a PowerPoint to share with the board, and this is the district's 2-year budget, which is the near-term financial plan for the district. The budget is designed to balance short and long-term financial goals, support improved customer service objectives, finance key infrastructure needs, advance water conservation, meet new legislative and regulatory mandates, accomplish fishery restoration projects, protect and optimize use of water supplies, and improve the district's preparation for emergencies such as seismic events. And the purpose of this evening is to allow the board to review forecast revenue, operating expenses, capital expenditures, as well as staffing levels and labor-related costs for the next 2 years. And we're happy to start working through our PowerPoint that we have shared.
All right. Well, good afternoon. There's a lot of information, or so the first 25 slides about the district that we're going to go ahead and skip over, but they'll be available in the public record unless there's an interest amongst the board for us to review those slides. But they provide good background about the district and our operations. And so I'm just going to go ahead and advance.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm going to go ahead and just advance us up to that point.
And while John advances, for members of the public that are here, there's good general information about ACWD. as well as what the board has requested is that staff links the activities that we're working on with the strategic plan, the 5-year strategic plan that the board of directors completed about a year or so ago. It gives you a feel of some of the accomplishments as well as the priorities for ACWD over the next couple of years.
So before we jump into things too much, I'd also like to recognize all the staff that are here with us, as well as a number who aren't here with us, who have worked very cooperatively to develop this budget, which aligns very well with our strategic plan, as well as being financially prudent and allows us to maintain the same overall future rate increase assumptions as was discussed during our recent rate setting process. And so with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Aum, our supervising financial analyst, who will talk a little bit about our budget process and assumptions. We'll then turn it over to our senior financial analyst, Mr. Karan, who will walk us through our budget overview, including an initial change we've made to the presentation in our first little step toward qualifying for the GFOA Budget Presentation Award. After that, we'll turn it over to Mr. Stevenson and Ms. Ipakunta for a review of our capital improvement program. And then Mr. Aum and myself will then complete the presentation reviewing the standard financial planning metrics and next steps. And so with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Aum.
Thank you, Mr. Wanderlich. Good afternoon, board members. My name is Sethy. I'm the new supervising financial analyst. And I will be presenting, as John mentioned, the budget process and assumption, as well as some of the planned activities that the district included in the 2-year budget. So as for the assumption and plan activity, as you've heard from Mr. Wanderlich, the district makes prudent investments in infrastructure replacement and seismic improvements to enhance our water system reliability. Our budget includes some of these major projects in the CIP, the main replacement and seismic improvement program, small diameter main renewal program, the Alameda Creek Fish Passage project Mr. Shaver alluded to earlier, and the clean energy program implementations. The board had, through the board action previously, we have reduced the long-term costs by responsibly funding the pension and other post-employment benefits. Liabilities, as of June 30th, 2017, as reported in our comprehensive annual financial report, our total unfunded liability is $111 million. Of that, $80 million is for pension, and $31 million is for other post-employment benefits. The district, again, the board had approved, the district is on a 15-year, 6.5% level dollar advanced funding schedule, and the end date for the schedule is June 30th, 2032. That's just a little bit over 13 years from now. The budget includes payment for pension at $11.4 million over the next 2 years, and $2.4 million for OPEB. Note that this is only the advanced funding component of it. The district, as you know, also paid a normal cost and a portion of the unfunded accrued liabilities, which total $16.1 million for pension and $5.2 for OPEB. We'll speak briefly on the AMI project. That's one of our major projects in the CIP. Just to cover briefly the schedule and the funding. So staff will present the procurement process and evaluation criteria to the board at the May 29th board workshop. That's coming up. We plan to complete the award of contracts and implement the proof of concept in fiscal year 19 and 20. And that includes deploying 3,300 operational meters with all the infrastructure, software, and workflows in place to support the full deployment. And it is anticipated that the full deployment of about 84,000 meters will be complete over the next 4 years. For the project funding, staff has already completed the initial funding application for the state revolving fund loan for the full implementation. And the financial planning model includes the assumption that the district is going to issue debt to fund $14.5 million of the project, or 50%. Now, depending on the SRF loan application process, we could utilize that for the full implementation, the full cost. But if we get that, because SRF loan has low interest, depending on the timing of that, the board could pursue other financing options, and they include industry finance, district issued debt for the full amount, state revolving fund loan, the iBank loan, that's another option, or self-finance.
There is one that I would add here that I brought up before. That's the California Energy Commission, which is offering rebates based on lowering your truck rolls out to the field by replacing with AMI.
So I do have a question about the SRF funding. It has a matching requirement, right? Even if we're approved for full implementation. No? It's actually 100% funded? Okay.
And one other thing, when we were down at the Aqua Conference in one of the energy sessions, they were talking about grants from the California Public Utility Commission too. I think, Judy, you were in that? Yeah, which I found surprising, but they had presenters. Oh no, Ed, I think it was you were in that one with me. And we talked about that after that session. I'd not heard about water districts receiving money.
Yeah, and we've not looked into the PUC program yet. That was the first I heard of it too. But as part of our grants team, we've got a whole list of programs that we look into and try and take advantage of, and so we're going to be looking into that one.
So the total project budget for the project is $28 million. That's spread over 4 years. The budget assumes the projected bill demand at 34 million gallons per day for fiscal year 1920 and 2021. Our long-term financial planning model assumes flat projected bill demand at that MGD is 34 MGD going forward. Staff continue to evaluate various initiatives to ensure water supply reliability. Included in the budget are funding for the California Water Fix Delta Conveyance Project, the Los Vaqueros Reservoir Expansion, and the Joint Purified Water Feasibility Evaluation. Some of our key assumptions. To maintain the financial health of the district, the board had approved a 4% rate increase effective March 1st, 2020. But our financial model assumed future annual increases at 3%. SFPUC has informed us that they are not proposing to increase rate over the next 2 years. However, when we looked at their updated projections, they do show a cumulative increase of 24.1% over the following 3 years.
And that's a slight increase from what they've shown us in the past for those 3 years.
The employee labor and benefit costs are consistent with our recent labor negotiation with all our labor groups. That's included 3% cost of living adjustment this July 1st, 2019, and 3% effective July 1, 2020.
So, go back one slide. So, I guess we might acknowledge that you have a line for California Water Fix Delta Conveyance. It no longer exists in the form that we thought it would be. So this will be a placeholder dollar amount that will just be kept there for whatever comes next, correct?
Correct, and that's
Okay.
why it's slash Delta Conveyance now instead of just water fix.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Chances are, though, it will not get less expensive.
Right. No, I just want to acknowledge that we as a team understand that there potentially will be a change, and
Yep.
we're planning for it. Thank you.
The flex dollars for employees medical is capped at the 2017 contribution amount. Employees hired on or after January 1st are enrolled in our defined contribution retired health benefit plan. Additionally, 16 employees have opted into that plan.
That's a little higher than we were expecting. And that includes both MCP and a few union employees as well.
Just want to briefly go over our flow chart for the district financial planning process. So the process everything starts with the public input. So we receive public input through various channels such as budget and budget workshop, board meetings, public hearings, community meetings, and other channels. And all that input feed into our three major plans. That's the Integrated Resources Plan, the 25-year capital improvement program, and our biannual budget. All that feed into our financial model. That's what we use to build our budget. The district used the model to make various forecasts that build our budget. Staff presented the financial planning model to the board over the last year and earlier part of this year, again with public input during the rate setting process. At the end of the rate setting process, the board had approved the rate increases for 2 years. That's 4% effective March 1st, 2019, and another 4% effective March 1st of 2020. After the board had approved that rate increase, the rates are set. We use that to build our biannual budget, and here we are in the process of that. Just want to quickly go over our fiscal year 18-19 performance. That's looking at our fiscal year 18-19 amended budget compared to the fiscal year 18-19 projected estimate, the year-end projected estimate. Total expenses are in line with budget, and Mr. Martin Coran will show that in more detail in a more detailed slide. Our total revenue is projected to be $3.3 million higher than budget. And through board action, we made additional payments for OPEB and pension in the amount of $5.1 million approved in February. Our general fund balance is projected to increase $6.2 million from $92 million to $98.2 million.
So I have a couple of questions here. So the $5.1 million has already been, the payment has been made for this fiscal year.
Yes.
And we're going to entertain something for the following fiscal year?
So what this is referencing is the additional payment that we made after the rates were adopted by the board, because it included the accelerated schedule.
Right.
So we went ahead and those payments were made, I believe, in late February following that board meeting. What we're going to talk about at the very end of the meeting, so the base budget keeps us on the 15-year schedule.
Mm-hmm.
What we're going to talk about at the end of the meeting is, and I'm giving the end away a little bit before we get there, but what we see here is a $6.2 million general fund balance increase. The amended budget assumed that we would have a general fund increase of $3.7 million. So we're finishing the year off $2.5 million ahead of what our planning forecast was.
Mm-hmm.
And typically we see financial performance that's slightly better than our forecast, because we tend to be pretty prudent and conservative with our financial estimates. And so the discussion we want to initiate with the board this evening is, when our performance exceeds expectations, what do we want to do with those available funds? Do we want to maintain them in reserves? Do we want to make additional payments on these liabilities? what other ideas might the board have. We're just trying to initiate that discussion, though, and then the idea is next spring, when we bring our mid-cycle budget update back, we would have an estimate of our actual performance, and then make a formal decision at that time if funds are available and what we want to do with it.
That sounds good. I'd also like to go back to slide number 30. And under where we have continued evaluation of initiatives, I'm wondering if I could offer to our staff and the rest of the board whether we would consider earmarking some funds for completion of the study that we started on Lake Del Valle. And I know there's one other director interested in that. And I thought if we could just earmark a dollar amount for what that might cost, and then bring it to maybe the Water Resources Committee for a review before having it considered by the full board.
This is for just for the Del Valle operation part, right? This is not relocating the East Bay Regional Park part.
Yes.
Okay. Understanding that is only for the reoperation using advanced weather detection technology, yes, I could support that.
Okay.
So there's a difference.
Favor bringing it back to the Water
Right.
Resources?
Just so that I make sure I understand, there's sort of a different, there is a spectrum of possibilities with Del Valle.
Right?
There is, say, lowering the intake for the park's water supply,
Right.
which would allow for the reservoir to be operated at lower levels while still keeping the park theoretically operational. That's one thing. There's the reoperation associated, that could be associated with forecast-informed reservoir operation, which is sort of a different thing. And then there was the concept of, yes, relocating the park district. I assume that's off the table.
It's off the table for me. Sorry.
To actually, relocate all the park
yeah.
facilities.
That's off the table for me.
So I'm interested in the other directors' thoughts about that.
Well, my thought was to discuss what all three options were, what the cost might be with each one, then bring it back to the full board for a discussion so we can evaluate which course of action we might be interested in.
Okay, what we could do...
But I know that was over $1 million to complete
Yes,
the study.
the $1 million was basically to complete an application for Proposition 1 funding.
Right.
There are other things that we can look at that don't involve that right now, that we could talk about internally as staff and come back to the board about what potential options there are and put some costs on it. And we could do, it might take us a little while to really kind of hang some good numbers on these different options. So I think for the purpose of the budget, if we can do that prior to the board adopting the budget, we can incorporate it into a board meeting, either the upcoming AMI-related board meeting or the June board meeting, the regular meeting in which the board hopefully will adopt the budget. And see what you might want to include in the budget. If we're not ready to provide that level of detail, then I would suggest we don't include this in the budget and we come back to the board for a budget amendment, and then we would do sort of the evaluation of the options at that time, including a potential budget amendment. So
I'm open to going either way.
Either approach. Okay, so I'm looking at Water Resources staff about...
I was trying to interpret a text message for our engineering manager.
Maybe
If
I'll
you could
just tell
maybe
you
update
out
that,
loud.
and I can tell you.
So there's a small amount of money in the capital improvement program, actually as an extraordinary expense, to further pursue Del Valle alternatives in the next fiscal year.
Okay.
That's for studies. Yeah.
Yeah.
We did what I think we're hearing is there was a recommended, if it was going to be a project, what we would recommend that project be. And we do have a placeholder number for that. We had KSN develop an estimate for that project. So that number is available.
Okay.
But I would suggest perhaps it gets included in the planning workshop that we're going to have in July, because there were a number of uncertainties associated with that, and perhaps it could be taken up at that workshop.
Okay, so what I heard, at least from 2 directors, maybe 3, is that there's some flexibility on timing there. So we will have a Lake Del Bell powwow with staff, and then I'll let the board know kind of when we would bring that issue back to the full board. And I think we should bring it to the full board as opposed to committee, personally.
That's fine with me. I thought we would start it maybe in the committee for a review and...
We'll see what we have and then sort of decide from there if that's okay. Because I know the board has different opinions on these issues.
Just to clarify, so what's included in the capital improvement program currently is an evaluation of all 3 options?
It looks like it's just very minor work related to IRP level analysis related to Del Valle. Mr. Nizer.
Yeah, it's just a further refinement on the existing. We did that sort of 35,000-foot flyover. We got a cost estimate for lowering the lake, putting in a new intake and a new boating structure. It was about $10 million. We said, well, maybe we'll spend a little money to sharpen the pencil on those numbers.
Okay. So, if it's okay with the board, let us go back. It sounds like we might be back in the July time frame. We'll see what we have and go from there. Fair enough?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, with that, I would like to turn it over to Mr. Martin Coran to go over our budget overview.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. Good afternoon, members of the board. My name is Martin Coran. I'm the Senior Financial Analyst. I'll be presenting the budget overview. So one thing you'll notice, all the finance slides have the same format. That will be showing the prior year, fiscal 17-18, the actual activity in 17-18, as well as the 18-19 amended budget, and the estimated actual, along with the 2 proposed budget years. Now this is part of the effort to obtain the GFOA budget award. The percent variance column compares the current year estimate with the current year amended budget. So overall, revenues are expected to come in about 2.4% better than budget, mainly due to development activity. Water revenues are actually expected to come in a little lower, about 2% lower than budget, and that's due to the wet seasons we've been having. Getting into water revenue in a little more detail, we've already discussed forecasted demands are budgeted conservatively at 34 million gallons per day. In 18-19, we made adjustments to the residential fire line revenue loss, as well as lowered the bill demand from what we had originally budgeted, 35.2 million gallons per day, down to 34.
A little louder.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I appreciate that. Let's see. So then, after for 1920, starting next March 1st, 2020, there will be another 4% water rate increase approved by the board, which was already approved by the board. And then the financial planning model also assumes 3% rate increases thereafter. For groundwater revenue, the board recently approved a 5.3% increase at the April meeting. Moving down to property tax, there was a state water contract tax adjustment, basically down, an adjustment down, negative $1.9 million, and that is going to be phased in over 3 years. Interest revenue are going to be budgeted at 2.17% for this year and the remaining years throughout the financial plan, and that's just based on the most recent earnings report that we received from PFM, the district's financial advisor.
May I ask a process question?
Sure.
Do we really need to go through every single line item?
Absolutely not.
Maybe you could just give us the global picture on changes in revenue, and we've got a lot of slides to go through where there's line items.
Sure. I appreciate that. I will do that. I just wanted to then point out the new buy-in facilities connection charge, the FRF portion. So that's the new charge that you will see. This new fee is being phased in over 5 years, and that was approved by the board during the rates process. And as I already mentioned, revenues are expected to be 2.4% above budget for this fiscal year.
The line item that we can't just skip over though is the grants. Because when we're able to sort of land state and federal grants, it definitely helps us moderate our water rates. And the staff, I just signed an agreement a couple of weeks ago, $5 million grant funding. That's a happy day. So staff has been doing an excellent job with grant revenue.
Can you highlight what that $5 million is for? Is it for the fish ladder?
It is for the
Okay.
Rubber Dam #1 fish ladder.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. So this next slide is the graphic version of the table that you just saw. This just illustrates the overall expected revenue growth based on the most recent assumptions we already discussed. Next up is total expenses. So overall for fiscal year 18-19, total expenses are in line with the budget. And we have source supply costs are budgeted at 37 million gallons of production demand. Customer accounts, the electronic bill pay system has been very popular with customers. There's a 70% payment volume with the customers, so they're using it. 70% of customers are using electronic bill pay. It's working wonderfully. And with that is associated costs, because we didn't assume it would be as popular.
Have we seen any behavioral changes, as in customers more likely to pay on time, paying earlier? Any kind of feedback on that with electronic bill pay?
So not yet on that. That's something we're starting to look at is what we in customer service, kind of accounting speak, call aging, which means how much of the water bills are past due. So it's something we are starting to look at, but we don't have a formal analysis on that to share yet.
So one of the major expenses is the OPEB and pension advance funding, which we've already discussed. So we're on the 15-year payoff schedule at 6.5%. The level dollar payments ending June 30th, 2032. There are also a couple of expense projects over the next 3 years that are fairly large dollar for expense projects. One is the Los Fronteras expansion, roughly $1.1 million. And then IT has some enterprise upgrades for our various systems, Cayenne and JDE. The next major cost on this slide is related to our aggressive capital program over the next few years. Just some major project funding over the next 3 years. That's including 18-19 and then to fiscal 2021. Rubber Dam 1, $27 million. AMI, $11.4 million. Shin Pond Fish Screens, $11.1 million, just to highlight a few. So some big ticket projects happening over the next few years. And then something new on here for debt service. This includes current debt service schedules, but it also includes potential debt issuance related to AMI starting in fiscal 2021. We'll get into a little more detail later. And this next slide again is just a graphic version of the table we just discussed, showing the overall expected total operating expense changes. So above are the actual and estimated cash balances for all funds for the beginning and ending of each fiscal year. Since fiscal 17-18 ended better than originally estimated, our 18-19 fiscal year started off on better footing. So taking into account the revenues and expenses already discussed, we expect to finish this current fiscal year $7 million, that's across all funds, $7 million better than last year. The ending balance in fiscal year 2021 is projected to be about $4 million below fiscal 17-18, but that's mainly due to the aggressive capital program that we have. You also notice the debt proceeds for potential debt issuance, $14.5 million are visible there on fiscal year 2021. This next slide illustrates the district's reserves and debt indicators. The main takeaway from this one is that reserves meet or exceed the established targets. If you care to, I can go into detail about what those reserves are just for the sake of the public, or I can move on.
Sure.
For our debt service reserve, this requirement is 10% of the issued amount of the bonds, the 2009 water bonds, plus the premium amount. The management retirement bonus that's up there was discontinued in January of 2001, but we still have 12 active employees that are eligible, and that liability is calculated by our actuary. The emergency reserve is per board direction. The operations and maintenance reserve is 3 months of budgeted water revenues. Our capital reserve is 1 year of water system depreciation, but this also includes reserves above the target because of the money needed to cover over the next several years to cover the district's aggressive capital funding program. And lastly, we have the rate stabilization reserve, which is 6 months of variable water sales. So this is the amount above the base sales during the recent drought. And this initial amount of $9.1 million was set by policy.
We're going to be bringing some very small adjustments to the district's reserve policy to Finance Committee next week. And because it hasn't gone to the committee yet, we don't have it here this evening, but we'll bring it to the full board in conjunction with the budget in June. But very, very minor changes.
Remind me why we are reducing the rate stabilization reserve from 9.1 down to slightly below 6.
Yeah, so it's set at 6 months of variable water sales. And initially, when we set it at the 9.1 million, that was based on where we expected variable water sales to be in a few years once we kind of reached our new normal expected water demands after the drought. The reason why we show it coming down here in the subsequent years, and that's something we'll talk about with the committee next week, is these numbers are based on the actual variable water sales that we expect to see in the next couple of years, whereas the 9.1 was kind of set by policy just at the maximum amount once we hit kind of our new normal again.
And backing up one slide. Is there concern on the part of staff at all that we're going from relatively positive net of revenues and expenses to going much deeper than even the proposed budget for we're going down to 20 million negative?
So that's got to do a lot with the timing of capital projects. When we get to the end of the presentation and we look at our general fund ending balances, what we'll see in that slide is that we're well above our reserve target right now, and over the next 2 or 3 years we're going to spend those reserves down, but then we're going to level off. And the reason for that is the capital program is very aggressive the next few years with the fish ladder projects, AMI projects, as being a couple of the main drivers. Once those projects end, we don't anticipate projects of the same cost coming into the capital program. And so our revenue and expenses will then be pretty well aligned after those next couple of years.
So I went through all those other slides at the end, toward the end, and so I saw that I'm asking the question really for the benefit of a couple of the board members, the public, so that people are not alarmed when they see us suddenly going from positive into, 20 million negative.
But it is also, I think, a part of the reason why we're looking at debt issuance for the AMI program, because if we were to take that all at once, that would knock our reserves all the way down pretty quickly. So we do have the 14.5 million of debt issuance proceeds that will come in and will mitigate the cash flow impact.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay. Now we're going to get into some slightly more detail. The above slide has a more detailed breakdown of operations and maintenance expenses. These costs are highly dependent on water purchases, power, and chemicals, and these can fluctuate widely from year to year. We'll get into these details a little later. But please notice that 17-18, the actual activity was significantly lower than expected, and this was due to the timing of the San Francisco water payments. We also had some California State Department of Water Resources true-ups. There were lower power costs as well as lower chemical costs. So 17-18 looked really good. This next chart again illustrates the changes in those O&M expenses from year to year based on the data from the prior table.
I have a quick question. So the source of supply for semi-tropic, is that the cost of storing water then? Or is that the cost of bringing it back?
That's our contract with semi-tropic. That's sort of our fixed annual amount. That doesn't include the actual water, but it does include a certain volume of moving water down there as well as taking it back, depending on what our needs are.
Thank you.
Right, next are administrative and general expenses. That's a long list up there. Basically, the main point of this slide is just to show administrative and general expenses for 18-19. They're expected to come in at budget and over the next couple of years grow by about 4%. The growth is mainly as a result of recent labor agreements, increased benefit costs as a result, OPEB, as well as some professional services, such as the popularity of the electronic bill pay system. Also on the slide, expense credits play a big role in the overall bottom line. In 18-19, so this current year, the estimated actual is expected to be about $3 million less of expense credit, less than budget, and that's due to the lower than budgeted capital activity. So larger expense credits are expected in the proposed budget years due to the aggressive capital program. And again, this next slide just shows a pretty picture associated with the numbers in the previous slide. So these next two charts illustrate the percentage breakdown of general fund labor costs by cost center, including capital projects. This chart shows the general fund proposed budget of $141.1 million for fiscal 19-20, of which labor is 36% of the total. This is actually quite small, but because we're a water utility, we rely heavily on infrastructure, so we have relatively low labor costs. And just for comparison purposes only, because I used to work in the city, in general, city labor costs are 85% or more. So we're doing really well.
The city of Fremont is right up there because most of it is going for police, fire, and human resource services to the community.
This next chart shows total general fund proposed budget for fiscal 2021 of $155.4 million, of which labor is 33%. So the labor percentage went down because capital project, the expenses are going up. This next slide just illustrates labor expense by cost center by fiscal year. And as you'll notice, the total labor expenses are expected to be up 4.7% compared to budget. That's as a result of recent labor negotiations. Plus, there have been less vacancies. That means more positions were filled than in prior years. And there were 3 additional defined term positions, as well as recent retirements and associated payouts of accumulated leaves.
So just focusing on one line item here, we've been criticized in the past for our rising administrative and general costs. So can you help explain, just for community benefit, why we see that trend line, changes that we've made?
Well, part of it has to do with the administrative and general fees. Expenses also include our OPEB, so pension unfunded liabilities, our advanced payments. And so as the board has been more aggressive in trying to fund these unfunded liabilities, a big portion of the increase has been as a result of as a result of that.
And it gets put into that bucket.
Correct.
Right.
Oh, actually, and that was, well, that's associated with labor. So the pension portion, the pension costs themselves are increasing as well. The unfunded liability portion of advance payments, I'm sorry, they're actually on the benefit side. But that's also all included in the administrative in general. So moving, if I can move on to the employee benefits, then we'll get into that. So this was a summary of employee benefits. I'm going to highlight 5 main categories. First one being pension. So for this current fiscal year, the numbers, the estimated actual is based on prior year staffing cost estimates. We've updated them, updated labor for the next 2 fiscal years to reflect current staffing, and it also includes the latest actuarial information for normal cost and unfunded liabilities for the pension side. We also have medical costs. 18-19, the current year is based on actual activity, and then the next 2 years, the costs are budgeted at full staffing. So if we had 233 fully staffed positions, and those costs are also based on the flex dollar cap, which is applied to employees in each plan. So fiscal year 19, 20, and 2021 are equal to each other because of the cap. The costs aren't expected to increase for the district. And then we have dental, as well as standard OPEB costs, retiree health costs. And those medical cost increases for the next 2 fiscal years, those are based on the OPEB actuarial assumptions. And that was 7.5% for the first year and 7.25% the year after that in 2021. And then lastly, the big piece of this pie right here is the advance funding for the OPEB and the pension. Again, 15-year payoff at 6.5%, ending June 30th, 2032. To be fully funded.
I would just like to note one nice line item, which is the reduction in workers' comp. And I thought maybe Mr. Lito could tell us why.
We did an RFP this past fiscal year. The board's familiar with lots of discussions about earthquake insurance recently, but part of that RFP was a change for our workers' compensation, property and general liability insurance to a new vendor, which is Aqua JPIA. And that resulted in about a $600,000 reduction from our current premiums that we're paying with our current vendor. So that will start, services will start with that vendor July 1st.
Yeah, percentage-wise, it was a nice...
Significant.
Yes.
This chart shows authorized positions, vacancies, and retirements in fiscal year 15. In that year, the district had 238 full-time equivalent positions. Then it dropped down to 230 and is now at 233, 3 of which are defined term.
And if I may, in fiscal year 2014-15, we actually peaked at 240, and that was reduced by the end of the fiscal year. So this is year-end numbers. Thank you.
Just one more thing to point out on this slide, vacancies have declined as the district has become more fully staffed. So the next 2 slides will actually be presented by Jennifer Slito, our attorney.
This is a little interlude from our regularly scheduled budget presentation to talk a little bit about our temporary staffing. And this is in response to a question that was raised by the board actually back in February of 2019 when we had our regular quarterly personnel report presented to the board. And rather than make this a separate board item, we thought we'd wrap it into the budget presentation. Thank you, Martin and Sydney, for that. So the question that was raised back in February in the quarter report showed a pretty significant increase in our temporary staffing quarter to quarter, so from Q2 2017 to Q2 of 2018. What the report showed was a 145% increase. So to kind of explain break that down a little bit, hours quarter to quarter increased, like you see here, actually 75%. So not as shocking as the 145%. But the cost did increase 145%. So I think that's probably where that number stood out to several members of the board. So staff went back and looked back to 2016. So we're looking at not just last year, but the year before to see what, kind of what those increases had been, what we've been using staff resources, temporary resources for, and sort of ensure that we're not augmenting permanent staff and that it's appropriate use of temporary resources. So this is kind of a high-level summary. I'll go quickly through. In engineering, they use none in 2016. And they have kind of the lowest use of any department ongoing. We typically only see them using for construction inspectors on large projects where we don't have inside permanent staff that we can dedicate full-time to a project. And then more recently, some IT support. And actually one comment related to the 145% cost increase. Prior to about this last year, we were mostly using temps for admin support, office support, and kind of clerical, which costs less. But in the last year, and you'll see in a couple other departments, we've used more professional skilled type positions, so they cost a lot more. So that's why the cost went up disproportionate to the hour increase quarter over quarter. So with water resources, they sort of consistently back to 2016 used water conservation temporary staff, which was originally for drought planning, and then transitioned into kind of more conservation programs. Although we have seen a reduction in that in the last couple of years as they've been accessing fellow students. So they're still using outside resources, but through a different program, our Civic Spark fellows. So our next group for finance pretty consistently uses temporaries related to customer service support for project implementation when we're doing EBPP, and our staff have been, for example, have been spent on other projects, and we'll bring in temporaries to help with phone coverage and things like that. And then there's, they have had some longer-term leave coverage in both metering and customer service, which is an appropriate kind of a good use of temp resources to cover till staff return. And we did have some ongoing kind of regular temp usage in the meter reading group, but that was addressed at the end of 2018, I think in December. The board approved the addition of 2 defined term meter reading positions. So you will see that decrease in the 2019 figures as we sort of corrected that usage. And then in operations and maintenance, we typically have regular temporary usage for the gardening, flushing program. And then we saw a kind of an uptick in 2018 due again to one staff, kind of a long-term leave coverage. And then increased support where we started using some engineering support for water resources, not water resources, water production projects, as well as backfilling 2 vacant positions. So that's the primary usage of those. So aside from where we actually saw the board take action to correct, like with meter reading some of those positions, where we had long-term usage, pretty, what I would consider appropriate usage of temporary staff resources, but they're becoming more costly. Any questions from the board, I'm happy to answer. Thank you.
All right, back to our regularly scheduled program. Now we're getting into the nitty-gritty of 3 of the main expenses within operations and maintenance. And these are the ones that can vary widely from year to year. The first one is purchased water. Overall, the district is avoiding 2 years of cost escalation in water supply costs, as we discussed a little earlier. You'll notice the green bar up there. The San Francisco water costs are to remain flat for the next 2 years. And staff is still targeting the minimum San Francisco water purchases over the next 2 years, despite rebounding demands. So if we need to buy more, we would have the offsetting revenue to cover it. For fiscal years 22 and beyond, we should see increases in water supply costs, but those are also already built into our financial planning model. Next is power. So the power budget is based on 2 major factors, the first one being water demands, which we've already discussed, and the second one being PG&E rates. So since PG&E does not provide rate guidance, we assume a 5% annual increase in rates. It's historically ranged from between 0 and 8%. The proposed budgets for the next 2 years are based on this year, plus 5% increase in PG&E. So power, along with chemicals, which we'll see on the next slide, they work together and are based on water production demands and projections. The third is chemicals. Chemicals are required to treat the raw water to drinking standards. Fiscal 17-18 costs were lower due to the high-quality water requiring less chemicals. This followed a similar trend as power. But chemical increases happened this fiscal year, and they're the result of increase in chemical pricing. The district participates in a regional consortium to ensure the best possible pricing for chemicals, but I'm just going to highlight 3 chemicals that have had kind of astronomical increases. Ferric chloride increased 14%. Sodium hydroxide increased 26%, and then sodium hypochlorite increased 46%. So staff, works diligently to negotiate to try to keep these costs down, but some things are just beyond control.
Well, I think what we found out in the last recession was that some of these costs actually came down. It's due to a lot of competition in the marketplace, a lot of demand for limited supply.
One of the things that concerns me is we still don't know what tariffs might do in a lot of our capital improvement programs, projects, maybe some of these costs. We don't know.
2 more slides from me. The second to last one shows the district's debt service and outstanding debt. And this is according to the official debt service schedules. Debt service is flat at $6.4 million per year during the budget years, including payments on a potential debt issuance for AMI. As you can see in the debt service portion, as well as on the outstanding principal portion, there is proposed debt proceeds of $14.5 million in fiscal year 21. This final slide of the budget overview shows capital expenditures from year to year and their associated funding sources. As you can see, the capital program budget increases significantly over the next few years, from $17.1 million last year to $59 million in fiscal year 2021. So with that, I'll hand it over to Mr. Stevenson.
I have one question, if you can go back one slide. On the 2012 revenue bonds, where we've been making a pretty consistent payment, why is that going up so much in the last year?
So that would have been scheduled at the time we issued the bonds to coincide with the known end date of the 2009 bond payments to maintain flat debt service. Right, so when we issued those, we would have known 1920 was the last payment on the 09 bonds, and we would have scheduled the payment stream on the 12 bonds to be lower at first, so we didn't have a big budget hit initially, but then to pick up those payments starting in 2021 to kind of fill in where the other payment fell off.
So, if I remember correctly, we had like a payment schedule of paying down principal and interest and principal payments, right? So this was scheduled to go up.
Yes.
In the bond document?
Yes.
Okay. So will that stay consistently at about 3.9 now for?
Yes.
For what, the rest of the payoff term, or?
I would anticipate so. I would have to double check the schedule to say with absolute certainty, but I would expect it will stay at 3.9 million.
And on the 2015 revenue bonds, is there an expected bump in the future on that too?
I would have to take a look at the schedule. The 12 and 15 bonds are both 30-year bonds, whereas the 09 refunding was only a 10-year cycle. And so because the 12 and 15 only end 3 years apart, there's probably not going to be a big adjustment for the last few years of the 15 bonds. But what was unique about these is by the time we issued the 2012 revenue bonds, there were only 7 years left on the 09 bond series. And so that made it more practical to consider those schedules in the repayment plan for the 2012 bonds.
As I recall, that was originally a 30-year bond too, 2009.
No, it was a 10-year.
No, before.
Oh,
the
before.
Original debt financing was 30 years.
Yes.
But we hit the low interest rate right at the bottom of the recession.
Right.
To refinance. Okay. Got it.
Okay, so let's take a look at that aggressive capital program. But before we get started, I'll second what John said about staff's role in this process. The CIP is very much similar to the budget in the sense that it takes a lot of effort by a lot of people to accomplish. I get to share the results, but it reflects a lot of work by many. So we'll take a quick look at the overall, the function of the CIP. We'll take a look at its inputs and dependencies and how we update it. And we'll take a look at sort of the results of our CIP budget process and the proposed CIP that we're presenting tonight. And we'll kind of narrow it down from the overall 25-year CIP, sort of take a look at the 10-year CIP, and then also just the 2-year capital budget that's being proposed as we go ahead. So getting started in terms of the purpose and the function of the CIP, as we know, it's the district's long-range capital plan, so it spans the full 25 years. It's updated every year with major updates to sort of digging deeper and getting into the baseline assumptions of the various capital line items. That's done every 2 years, consistent with the district's 2-year budget cycle. The CIP is used for, of course, capital funding planning, but it's also used for resource planning and even planning associated with, the timing of facility outages and so forth. So what you're seeing is reflects a good deal of planning along those lines too. The CIP is developed along with the expense budget and other financial planning to be consistent with the financial planning model, and of course a big driver there is to be consistent with our rate structure in planning. So the priorities in the CIP are primarily driven by the district's 5-year strategic plan and also our long-range integrated resources plan. And of course, the strategic plan and the IRP also inform our financial planning model and our budget in other ways. But the CIP is also informed by our 10-year CIP engineering report, which is sort of an in-depth look at the major infrastructure needs of the agency. And so we do a thorough review every 10 years or so to inform our capital plan. Also, the CIP is informed by other operational capital expenditure needs and planning, facilities assessments, and other studies and so forth. And of course, the CIP is updated along with our budget on an biannual basis. So this slide here is just to simply indicate that CIP is guided by the financial planning model, and in this case, what we're proposing this evening is consistent with the financial planning model assumptions. So overall highlights. As mentioned, the CIP is consistent with the 5-year strategic plan. What we're proposing does not add significant new projects, new line items to the CIP. Primarily, we are updating cost estimates and schedules for programmed projects. There are new elements in various line items, but we're not proposing new significant additional projects. And importantly, this cycle, we've put a lot of time and effort into planning for those out-year capital needs. So we know as an agency, we have a 25-year long-range capital plan. And so we put a bit of extra emphasis this cycle in trying to capture and plan for future capital expenses that haven't been a focus in the past. So for instance, we know that, say, the ARP wells, every one of them is going to need to be replaced or have a major rehabilitation project done at some point. And so we wanted to ensure that at least we've captured budgetary estimates for costs like that in those out years, right? So there's more of a focus this cycle to ensure that we're capturing a realistic view, as realistic as we can at this stage, of those out-year costs. So with that sort of context, I'll turn it over to Rekha Ipagunza, our project engineering manager, who's been with us well over a month. Well over a month. And Rekha, as the sort of the CIP program manager, will walk us through some more of the details of the CIP.
Thank you, Mrs. Stevenson. Good afternoon, members of the board and members of the public. I hope you can hear me okay. I'm recovering from cold and my voice is not cooperating, but I will speak up. If you can't hear me, just raise your hand. That's a reminder to me to speak up. Okay, so in the next few slides, I will go over the capital improvement plan at 3 different time horizons. We'll start with our 25-year long-term plan, and then go over our short-range 10-year planning, then we'll focus on our near-term 2-year budget. So there is a lot of information on this slide, but I will try my best to summarize the key takeaways. So we are projecting our CIP budget over the next 25 years to be close to $1 billion. So that's a lot. So you must be wondering, where is all that money going? So first of all, we are looking into the bulk of the CIP budget is used for replacing our aging and at-risk infrastructure, which is nearly at 40%. So some of the projects that were identified in green are related to our infrastructure replacements, which includes our main renewable storage and distribution system replacement. And then this, a quarter of the budget is actually assigned or allocated for improving our supply reliability. So those projects are identified in purple, which include our fish passage, water reclamation, Los Vicaros reservoir expansion project. And then 1/3 of our CIP budget is allocated for our other initiatives, which includes our advanced metering infrastructure and clean energy and other capital projects that are needed to run the district.
So can we stick on this slide for a little bit?
Sure.
So just to clarify things in my mind, when we talk about roof replacement on reservoirs, is that under storage?
That is correct.
Okay. And when we talk about ARP wells, that's under production well?
Production well and equipment, pump equipment replacement.
And under water reclamation, can you give us a few examples?
So that's basically one of our projects that the board is aware of, which is related to the water reclamation facility, collaboration with Union Sanitary District and SFCUC.
So that's our water purification.
Correct. That's
Type of
really
water
the
project.
that's indirect potable reuse / recycled facility planning, where we program dollars way out in the future in the CIP to ensure that we've got the correct planning in place to support whatever it is that we do along those lines.
Okay, it was the first time I'd actually seen that in a presentation versus use of water purification or recycling, and so I just wanted it to be clear in my own mind, what are we talking about here? And then the last item was under clean energy implementations. It looks like we're just looking at the initial beginnings of a program that could be quite a bit more than 1.2 million.
This is the solar project implementations. We are looking at the PPA agreements of RFPs that are needed for bringing in consultants on board, so that cost would cover those. But actually, the actual cost of the project, we are anticipating that to be covered as part of PPA.
Right. So remember, in that purchase power agreement, the solar developer is really doing most of the funding, and essentially they're selling us that power back at a reduced rate. So we're benefiting financially without putting that big capital outlay. So what's in the capital program reflects that model, and so that we're not putting a lot of capital dollars out in order to have those clean energy systems installed.
I don't want to go up on a tangent here, but I think we could bring it up at a future discussion about clean energy. Director Huang and I sat in an extremely interesting presentation on how PPAs are put together, implemented, all of the risks that are involved, both from the vendor side, the customer side, it went into real in-depth particulars, and I found it most fascinating because I felt like I was really educated and I can bring something back to this district from that really useful seminar. So we'll bring that up later on. Which means I'm better prepared with questions.
Shot across the bow.
Be ready.
But we will be bringing back that issue. So if you would like to ever send us questions in advance when we're putting it on the agenda, that's always appreciated too.
Of course.
Thank you.
Okay, again, this is a detailed overview of our 25-year CIP plan, provides a breakdown of the budgets year by year. Some of the key takeaways here, in the near-term focus for the next 2 years, our average expenditures are expected to be in the $54 million range. This is significantly higher than our historical average. We'll discuss about that in the later slides, but I just want to give you an average expenditure per year. So looking at the out-year focus, we are looking at $32 million per year. Investment, and then there are 3 exceptions identified or highlighted on the slide. Those are our out-year exceptions. In fiscal year 31-32, we do have a couple of projects which are non-standard projects that were built into the CIP. One is Vallecito's channel betterments for $9 million and Mission San Jose treatment plant recommissioning upgrade for another $16 million. That adds up to $25 million. That's one exception for fiscal year 30-31, and in 34-35, we do have a couple of projects, interconnection between Nice and Newark for $13 million, and also we have a second project for Patterson Reservoir upgrade, that is another $12 million. Again, these two add up to $25 million.
And I'll point out that as those projects approach the date that we'll execute them, there'll be additional planning, and what will happen is those big spikes will actually flatten out, but what they'll do is they'll increase the amount in the former and subsequent years, right? So that's not really how the spending is likely to occur, but that's from a budgetary standpoint. Those are the dollars are sort of parked.
So another big spike in 41-42, that's again related to the water reclamation facility that we have discussed a few minutes ago. So we have budgeted about $126 million in that year, and again, once we get closer to those budgets, we expect these to change for the better. This is another illustration of our 25-year CIP. So the brighter orange, the way you look at it, it could be orange or yellow. But the brighter shades indicate the projects that we're proposing for improving reliability. As you can see, 60% of our capital improvement plan is allocated for improving reliability. And then we have another 30% that are allocated for enhancing our water supply and water quality initiatives. And we do have other capital that are required for running the district. And we do have 10% allocation from customer jobs that's reimbursed, and they do not influence the rates.
So just a quick question. I assume you're defining reliability differently on this slide versus on slide 63 when you have system reliability, right? This reliability includes the improvement to our aging infrastructure, correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
So this is broken down by different areas of reliability operation.
Yeah, you just called it differently, but I just want to make sure that our customers understand that when we say reliability, it does include improvement to our aging infrastructure. We're not just looking at operational reliability.
That is correct. Thank you. This is another view of our 25-year CIP by funding source. If you are wondering where the funding is coming from for the $993 million budget, so about 70% of the CIP is coming from the ratepayers. And then we have 21% funded by development-related charges. And then we do have other 10% customer jobs that's reimbursed. So this is the breakdown of funding sources. And then moving on. So now we are transitioning from 25-year plan to 10-year plan. So for 10-year plan, we have divided that by program, just understanding what are our initiatives. Based on our district's initiatives, we wanted to give a breakdown of how much we are spending on each initiative. A quarter of the budget over the next 10 years will be spent on main renewal program. This is a long-running program with $10 million per year for the next 10 years and beyond. And then we do have about 31% for fish passage, AMI, and storage improvements that are also part of our strategic initiatives. And then everything else falls under other capital. So some of the key projects that make up other capital, these are some of our replacements and vehicle capital, equipment and tools that are again required to run the district. And then we do have the booster upgrades and reservoir expansions, and this also includes some IT projects.
Actually, Rick, on that last slide, one thing I'll point out just briefly is the line item production well and pump replacements. Each one of these is really a collection of several line items in the actual CIP. It's just a quick note that what the board sees in the way of the proposed CIP spreadsheet here, we already know it's obsolete and outdated, because we actually have one of the line items has to change as a result of some work that's going on right now related to some well pumping equipment. So one of the things that we'll include in the staff report in June for the board's adoption is a list of any changes to the budget or the CIP that have occurred since this workshop. And one of the things we'll point out is an additional $60,000 for one of the line items in the CIP having to do with some pumping equipment.
In the previous slide, where we're talking about the main renewal program, and I realize you weren't here for the last decade at the district, but I would like to bring up the concern, it's been expressed by Director Weed as well, that we talked about doing main renewal for such a long time, but then we had the recession that we went through, and then the drought that affected our finances, and so we kept pushing out main replacements, kind of like kicking the can down the road. And although we've gotten started, we know we have this big bell curve that's facing us on the aging of our pipelines. And so I'm a little concerned that maybe we're not more aggressively planning for main replacement. But maybe $10 million a year right now is adequate for the forecast period that we're looking at within the 2 to 5 year budget. But at some point, I think this is going to catch up with us, and we may have to outlook spending $20 or $25 million to stay ahead of that big, retirement in the aging of our system. So something to think about.
Yeah, I agree. I think in future we may need to ramp up the program to accommodate for the deferrals from prior years. And currently we are looking at $10 million that gives us a replacement rate of anywhere between 0.6 to 1%, which translates to 100-year replacement rate. In the best case scenario and worst case scenario is 160 years. So there is, I see a definite need to ramp up the program, but at least for now in the next 10 years
right.
We're looking at 0.6 to 1% replacement rate.
$10 million is close to 10 miles of work, right, with a variance between $500,000 and $2 million per mile. But we have 900 miles of pipeline in the system, and if you figure that at least a third of that is going to be at some critical point, that's 300 miles. And so I'm just working backwards on the numbers and saying, boy, maybe we need to be doing 25 to 30 miles a year, then I realize how that affects the community too, interrupts everything here. But those are big dollars, and so I think we need to maybe project out a little bit and figure out, well, what's the real need 5-10 years from now in your 10-year CIP? I think we're being exceptionally conservative.
Yes, those are valid concerns, and I'm sure the board members that were here when we were first talking about the main replacement program recall that the estimated life expectancy of the water mains is very approximate at this point still. So part of our strategy involved monitoring for pipe wall degradation, especially in the AC pipe, and doing field testing, so we can kind of update that estimate. The other thing is, General Manager, I'd like to see us do is actually get to the $10 million reliably every year, because then we've got a fully functional program that we can, either speed up or slow down depending on what we forecast the needs to be. So I agree 100% that, a 100-year replacement cycle is probably optimistic in terms of the life cycle, especially the AC pipe. But I think we also need to get a few years behind us and also continue to monitor the condition of the pipe. So, very valid concern, and I'm sure we'll be updating our plan over the next few years to reflect those concerns.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on to the next one. So this is an illustration of our 10-year CIP plan, doing a breakdown by year and the total budget we are anticipating. As I mentioned before, we have an aggressive budget target for the next 3 years, which is significantly higher than our historic average, as I mentioned before. Just to give you an idea where that is coming from, we do have some major implementations in the next 2 to 3 years. Those are coming from our fish passage projects and AMI implementation. So those two are adding up to the increase over the next 2 years. If those projects are completed, then the overall budget is consistent with the rest of the year.
When I looked at this chart for the first time, it reminded me of box organ notes, as one melody's going in, the other one's going out, and it reminded me of box notes, that you put on paper.
Yeah, that would be something else for the future years. Thank you for thinking of it that way.
Certainly made me remember the chart.
Okay, what else on this? Yeah, so overall I think our budgets are consistent with our standard typical projects for the rest of the years, with the exception of the first 3, at least for now. Okay, so here is a list of all the fun projects that engineering will be working in the next 2 years. So here we have a list of projects. I only have identified projects larger than $250 million. The list is longer than this. But this will just give you an idea where the bulk of the budget is, will be spent in the next 2 years. And here is the second list. There are some IT projects that made it to the list too.
So I think it's fair to say that, based on the comments that Mr. Stevenson provided earlier, that there's nothing terribly new and exciting in this list of projects in terms of what the board has seen before. I'm sure there'll be new and exciting projects.
That's exciting for me.
But it is consistent with what the staff's prior plan was, and also consistent with the 5-year strategic plan that the board adopted. So I think we can say that staff is standing by. If you have any specific questions about any of these projects, we'd be happy to respond to those. Otherwise, it's adjustments in terms of estimated costs and schedule.
There's a $1 million item missing here.
Uh-oh.
What is it?
Redoing the boardroom.
Well, there is a boardroom AV project in the CIP for construction next fiscal year, but it won't include carpet and seats and everything else.
I realize that.
The boardroom can wait.
We can wait.
I do have a question though. This new arc well, are we adding a new well or is this a replacement well for existing?
Yeah, it's to replace,
Okay.
I believe it's to replace an existing well.
Thank you.
I have a question, kind of going back to what Director Sethy was talking about. Knowing, and I'm coming in to the CIP conversation much later in the game. Have we thought about doing like a significant debt issuance to be able to speed up our capital improvement program? Maybe not right away because we're going to be doing one for AMI, but looking out 5 years or 10 years once we have, like Bob was saying, once we have a lot of experience and we're not issuing too much debt all at once.
Right. So there's nothing currently in our planning, but certainly as your finance manager, I think about that a lot because we may end up in a situation where we feel like we have a lot of miles of pipeline ending or nearing the end of their expected useful life. And one of the great strengths we have is, and unfortunately we didn't talk about this tonight because of how much we wanted to cover with the budget itself, but in June I'll be bringing some benchmarking to the full board that I've been reviewing with the Finance Committee the past couple of months. And one of the things that shows is that we have a great deal of financial capacity, and our overall debt burden relative to our revenues is very low compared to what you typically see in the water utility industry. So we do have a lot of capacity to issue debt if we felt like that was something we needed to do.
So while staff is thinking about that, we're only talking about the capital expenditure, but for all those projects, there's staffing implications. Number of staff available to do this work, do we need to do additional hiring? So in your evaluation, think about that too, because the budget implication is bigger than just the widget.
Right. And realistically, if we were going to significantly increase the magnitude of the capital improvement program, in addition to the cost issues, we have reached capacity in our building, so there would have to be other costs to support the program, likely either modifying the building, which in itself is a capital improvement program project, or renting space, perhaps, in the vicinity. So these would be all things that we have to think about in terms of significantly increasing the number of resources that we would need to be able to get more done. Certainly, over the next few years, as we monitor the condition of the distribution system, these are all things that we can and should consider.
Okay, if there's no other questions, I'll turn this over to Mr. Huang.
Thank you, Mr. Putta. I'm going to cover several key metrics from our financial planning model dashboard, as well as going over some significant changes that are incorporated into the financial planning model since the rate process. Again, as the general manager mentioned earlier, we secured another $5 million in grant for the Reservoir Dam number 1. Additional $13.3 million from the counties anticipated, and this amount is based on updated construction costs. the common theme for tonight, we added $20 million to the CIP. That's from over the 9-year period covered on the dashboard slide. We also adjusted the state water contract tax revenue to reflect revenue and expense variances and tune-up that Mr. Graham mentioned earlier. Our debt proceeds for the AMI projects was shifted out 1 year to reflect the updated project schedule. And the anticipated land sales revenue is shifted out 2 years based on new information that we received. We updated the SFPUC water purchase cost to reflect their updated projections. Here's the slide. This slide summarizes pretty much everything we discussed tonight. It looks at the 2018 rate study compared to the proposed budget, and I would just want to focus on the proposed budget. This is the general fund ending balances. The red line is our target balance, and that's the reserve for debt service, capital projects, emergency operations and maintenance, and rate stabilization, and so on and so forth. If you look at the fiscal year 1920 and 2021, that's the current 2-year budget. The ending fund balance, which is represented by the orange bars, are about $33 million over the target. So for over the next 2 years, we're about $33 million each year over the target. Going forward in a few years, the balances are trending downward, and that's again due to the aggressive CIP that we discussed earlier. And the balance starts to pick back up starting fiscal year 24-25.
And I think we should also point out one of the major assumptions on our general fund balance is what is water demand going to be. And right now, we've got relatively conservative estimates for the budget cycle, and then after that, we're on sort of the assumed rebound curve in terms of water demand. So our ability to predict is good, but not perfect. So that has huge implications to what fund balances are. So, I wouldn't get too excited about 2025 because there's so many variables and uncertainties between now and then.
Okay.
This next slide is the water debt coverage ratios. Again, we just talked about earlier. Director Akbari mentioned if there's any capacity for issuing a huge debt. If you look at the debt coverage ratio, the red line represents the policy target. That's 200%. That's 2 times total net revenue to our annual debt service. For the next 2 fiscal years, we are well above 600% for each of those 2 years. Again, the coverage ratios remain to be very strong in the out year as well. This is one of the factors that the Moody Investor Service looked at when they upgraded our bond credit rating. It's the debt coverage ratio.
Why do you put in there water debt coverage ratio? In the past, we've just said debt ratio.
We are a water district, so we should eliminate that word. That's correct. It's understood that it is the debt coverage ratio. Just want to be more specific.
I'm getting a little nitpicky.
Well, I think the history on that would come from the fact that we refer to our bonds as water revenue bonds, because it's water revenue that's the security for the bond holders.
This slide shows the revenues versus the expense comparison. Wanted to point out that the red line representing our the operating revenues, and the blue bars representing the operating expenses. Looking at the next 2 fiscal years, the blue bars are below the red. That means there's enough revenues, operating revenues, to cover operating expenses. There's some minors that in a couple of the years they fall below that. That's very minor. But that's the main takeaway from this, is that there's sufficient operating revenues to cover our operating expenses.
And and that operating revenue does or does not include property tax revenue.
Does not.
That's correct.
Okay, so operating revenues includes water revenues and connection charges. Does not include property tax. Does not include investment income. Does not include grants and reimbursements.
Thank you for the including depreciation.
Thank you, Calvin.
This is a metric that the board has shown interest in and would like to be responsive.
Again, thank you.
Thank you. So this next slide touch on what we talked about a little bit earlier. There's three components to that. This is looking at the rate revenue. This is represented by the red line going across. Rate revenue is really just revenues from water sales mainly. And the purple bar is the revenue requirement. That is how much we are required from rates to cover our rate revenue. So we look at over the 9 years, our rate revenues cover the requirement. That's very clear when you compare the red line to the purple bar. Now the blue bars indicated the general fund CIP. So when we added the CIP on top to the rate, the revenue requirement, it's showing that the rate revenue does not cover those two things. So the district relies on other funding sources, such as what Mr. Wondavich mentioned earlier, property tax, grants and reimbursement, and interest income, and other non-revenues, non-water revenue to fund the gap. And the district does have sufficient overall revenue to fund that.
And since a significant amount of our CIP is pay-go, it basically, it's almost like a sinking account when you have an aggressive CIP, like we are planning for the next, foreseeable future. Okay.
In this next metric slide, just to show again, to reiterate the CIP, over the 9-year period, we're adding about $20 million in CIP, $20 million into our CIP, and that's part of the reason it impacted the fund balance that we saw earlier.
Just staying on this slide, when we looked and saw on our general fund reserve chart how we had the 2 out years, the 2 years following the budget where we saw the big reductions in fund balance. Well, if you look at this chart, you can see that our general fund CIP in fiscal year ending in 22 went from 39 million before up to 48 million. And then for the year ending in 23, at the rate study, we were at 24 million, and now we're at 42 million. And so that's what's explaining those big drop-offs in reserves and kind of taking us from where we're at today down to right around our target line. So that concludes the typical metrics that we look at each budget with the board. And so this is the slide I previewed earlier in the presentation, where we want to begin the discussion with the board because of the prudent, conservative approach we tend to take to budgeting. What are the interests of the board? If we find ourselves in a position where we have the available funds, what do we want to do? So I guess I'm opening that up for some board discussion. Not that we're trying to give a definitive answer to that question tonight, but I'd like to open that up for some more discussion.
Yeah, and I think you provide a few examples.
Yes.
And, we've already talked about that the district has debt capacity. So we do have in our plan that we will take on some additional debt to fund primarily AMI. There's some good reasons to do that. Generational equity, it's a 20-year project, so customers that come into the service area or leave the service area over that 20 years aren't necessarily being saddled with an inordinate amount of the cost of that project in a rates impact right away. But again, it depends on how you feel about debt versus pay-go. We know that paying down pension and OPEB liabilities in an accelerated fashion saves our customers money in the long run. But if you do that, that money is not available anymore. It goes into a trust fund lockbox. So if you have some surprises, you reduce the amount of freeboard, if you will, that you have on your district ship to weather storms. And so those are two, sort of big philosophical issues. Staff is fine with it, or if you want to accelerate capital costs, or you can even get even more interesting about it, like provide a rebate to customers if you so wanted to.
You're reading my mind.
So, but we do know that our long-range spending forecast requires us to spend that money. It's not like it's just a windfall. It will be spent. So the question is, how do you want to spend it? Do you want to pay down, issue less debt? Do you want to pay down liabilities? Do you want to do something else?
Who wants to start?
So I figured I'd talk for a while so that the directors could, sort of collect their thoughts. And then what we're looking for is a conversation among the directors, and we'll just sit back and watch.
I've already talked too much.
Director Akbari?
Sure. From my vantage point, assuming until we hit some sort of a resource constraint, I think to me it makes most sense to put it towards the capital improvement program, because that's where we have the most need, and I think from our customers' perspective, that's where we have the most risk at this point. And so I think it would be prudent for us to look at opportunities for us to accelerate the capital improvement program, especially with main renewals. I'd be kind of open to the idea of doing an additional payment for our OPEB liability, but I think for me that would still be secondary because we are on an accelerated timeline. I think personally I feel pretty comfortable with the timeline that we've laid out and the way that we've gone about explaining it to the community. So for me the primary need really comes down to the capital improvement program. And if our main renewal program is placing our existing infrastructure at 0.6 to 1% per year, I mean, to me, like I said, I think that is where the most risk lies to the district currently, and I think that is where I would like to put more of our focus until we hit some kind of a resource constraint, of course, because it's not like I'm just saying hire X number of people to be able to do so until we hit that resource constraint with the engineering department. I would like to use that capacity that we have there.
The current budget assumes we're fully loaded on resources. There may be some things that we could do that would cost more money to implement projects because you reduce the productivity, you reduce the efficiency. For example, if we outsourced more projects like design build, you will potentially get more done, but it's going to cost you more per unit, typically. You do that to get more done quicker without permanently increasing the resources. And just so that the board is aware, we're not asking this decision to be made tonight.
Right.
We're just getting initial feedback, and what we're actually proposing is we'll be back in a year to kind of see where we are and see how our predictions are going with assumptions. But we'll have a little bit of a head start if we get some initial feedback now in terms of what your preferences might be. But it's still all valid input.
Well, I think, I kind of laid it out.
Yeah.
Kind of where my priorities
Perfect.
are. So.
No, I
Very
actually
helpful.
agree with Director Akbari. Actually, on top of my wish list is actually see if we have the resources to accelerate the make replacement program. I think outside the box, we have a year to think about the cost associated with accelerating this, how much would it cost per unit, so we could at least have a basis in a year to decide if it's even worthwhile for us to go down this path. I am open to pay down OPEB, but I think we did a really good job already compared to other districts and municipalities. I am also interested in seeing how difficult would it be to either give our customer a credit, or if any of the surplus could legally be redirected to our Help on Tap program, or portions of it. I know there are issues with different color of money and what can go into the Help on Tap account, but to that end, it might not be a bad idea to actually build up that Help on Tap account to give us some flexibility. So those are my wish list. George, just have
I have a few questions. First, on the capital improvement projects that are tied to Los Vaqueros, were we including the pipeline down to Byron Bethany
Yes.
in that cost estimate? Were we also, is there any line item for covering rehabilitation of the South Bay Aqueduct, which is a discussion that we had Freeway Agency last week?
No. If the way it's currently structured with the state water contractors and DWR, should the South Bay Aqueduct require rehabilitation, those costs would be incorporated into our sort of payments to DWR. And it's just another reason why we need to renew the current agreement that expires in the year 2035, because pretty much all capital work done by DWR on the state water contract, on the state water project, is funded by debt. So the longer we go without extending the debt window, the more problematic that will be. But the quick answer to your question is there are no, because we don't even have the conclusions of DWR on the condition assessment of the South Bay Aqueduct yet, there are no, there's no funds in the current district plan to address the SBA.
If we can go back a couple of slides to it's slide 76 and 77. As I long argued for, and we've only recently, in recent years, approached this, was to have operating revenues cover operating expenses, including depreciation, amortization. So we're finally there. And the reason I've kind of tried to set this as a goal was that any of the excess revenue that you have from property taxes, non-water revenues, can go to pay down your unfunded liabilities, which is really where it should go. If you don't even cover your operating expenses, including the depreciation and amortization, you can never get to that point, nor can you make proper investments in the future in your CIP. So the district for pretty much 20 years and until the last couple of years was sometimes markedly below covering its depreciation and amortization, which meant that we were backfilling with all of our non-water revenue to balance our budget. So that leads to
slide 77. But this is more of a policy decision for the board, and it's a little philosophical. I think we're on the right track here. I can buy into what the finance department is forecasting for what is the right revenue requirement, and that you're burning off a little bit of our head of steam that we've built up, you know, in our extra funds. So when I ask myself where we can best use the money, first off, and I say this with no disrespect to Director Huang, I would never consider a credit back to customers, especially when we have such major projects that we have to fund. There are plenty of non-water revenue sources to help fund additional funding on the Help on Tap program. We haven't even gotten close to hitting our cap. So I would explore those other alternatives first. I'm fairly comfortable with where we are on the pay down schedule for OPEB. Like Director Huang, I agree we're in actually much better shape than other utilities and cities and government agencies. So if we just keep at the pace we are, we have 13 years left. And it's not that dramatic of a number to pay down. Where I would like us to get ahead of the curve is on the pension liabilities that we have, which are growing much faster than inflation. And so if we could target our first dollars toward paying down our pension costs over the next 5 years, I think that's where we give our ratepayers the biggest bang for the buck. And when I was talking about outlooking accelerated main renewal, main replacement, I was trying to suggest that's beyond the 5-year period that we're looking at right now, more consistent with what Mr. Shaver is saying, so that we're looking at when the big bell curve comes into effect, and maybe it's in the latter part of the next decade where we start to accelerate things and we start to plan for perhaps debt financing of that. Under no circumstances do I wish to get into raising debt to pay down unfunded liabilities, which is what people get trapped into. So I want to make it very clear that our unfunded liabilities are paid back from our ratepayer revenues that come in, as well as non-water revenues. And so I think use of the property tax to pay down unfunded liabilities is a really smart thing to do. And when we think about the major projects we have outside of this next 5-year window, we've got really big projects, you know, post-2025. So the more we can clear off the table with our unfunded liabilities in the present few years, I think we're going to be much healthier for it. And I'm just putting on my own CEO hat, you know, what would I do with the dollars I have available?
And when it comes to the unfunded liabilities, where I've heard all three of you talk about that in some way, there's actually two ways to approach it. One way is to send money directly to CalPERS or into our trust fund for our retiree health care benefit. And when you do that, as Mr. Shaver said, it's there and it's kind of gone forever, right? So you kind of reduce your flexibility. There's another approach to it where you set up a separate trust fund and you allocate the money into that trust fund. And then if you find yourself in a tight situation in the future, you can actually use the money in that trust to pay your core pension requirement in the future year. So it's still tied up in the trust and can only be used for pension or OPEB benefit, but it's not quite as restrictive as a direct payment just into the big CalPERS fund. So depending on what the interests of the board are as we move forward with some of these discussions, there are some different approaches that can be taken.
Well, I would actually...
Director Huang, you're looking at me like you've maybe got a question about that.
Yeah, but if you set out separate trust funds, the whole concept of doing event funding is to save on future interest costs. So if you have a separate trust fund, you actually don't have that advantage, right? Versus direct payment.
Well, you don't have the advantage in your official report from CalPERS,
Right.
but you do have the advantage because you'll be earning your investment earnings on whatever you put in the trust fund.
And you think it would potentially offset to one?
Yeah, and,
okay.
And it would depend on the investment approach you took in the
Right.
trust fund. It could be similar to the approach CalPERS takes.
Okay.
We would just have to manage it.
You have to manage it. And
Yeah, that
hopefully
would...
we manage it well.
Well, we personally as district staff wouldn't manage it.
Or fund manager.
CalPERS is actually looking into setting up its own separate trust funds where you could deposit it in a trust with CalPERS. PFM, who's our investment advisor for our existing portfolio, manages these types of trusts, as do a number of other advisors.
Thank you.
Yeah, what I meant to indicate is there's costs associated.
Yes.
Yes, there are management costs.
However you decide to do it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, when I went through the presentation, and just a couple more comments, and went through all of the CIP projects, I feel good about the priority of the projects, as well as the dollar amount that we're investing and how it balances with everything that we're trying to do. It's like juggling a bunch of different balls at the same time, right? And to stay consistent with our engineering plan, I'd like to make sure that we really, for the next 4 or 5 years, just bear down on those seismically vulnerable spinal areas of our main system. That's the real critical area. And then I would appreciate it if staff could bring back to the board. There's one chart that I really like that you have that historically goes back like 20 years, and it shows how much of our unfunded liabilities we had paid off. And before the Great Recession, we were like up near 80% or something. And then it went way down to like 35-40% because of the collapse of the stock market. And we've been trying to grow ourselves back ever since, and still we're only up to about 62%. And my fear is if we are at the end of a prolonged economic cycle and we go into a recession again, which is inevitable, then we're going to see that amount drop off again. The percentage that we have contributed to getting close to an actual payoff. And we see this happening with other government entities in our own local area. Union City's struggling with this right now, and even at the peak of an economic cycle, they're still running a deficit, right? And they can't catch up with their unfunded liabilities. City of Fremont is totally out of hand, and I don't want to be one of those government agencies. I want to really try to take care of something that's manageable. Planning engineering is not all that manageable. You have to plan years ahead, right? But to pay down your unfunded liabilities, we can make quick decisions on those things, or how to reduce our healthcare costs, things like that. So expediency is part of managing things here too, where you can do it, where you can't.
All right. Do you have staff has enough thoughts from this?
I think so.
Any questions?
Do you have any more questions on that topic?
No, I think we heard some good discussion, and I think that gives us some really good feedback. Should we be in the position a year from now to have some funds available, and how we might approach using those funds. So we appreciate the discussion. And so we're just about at the conclusion of our workshop this afternoon. In terms of our goals, assumptions, our operating budget, and our CIP program, we did hear a few things from the board. I just want to make sure I've sort of captured what those things might be that could affect our budget for this next 2 years. I know there's been a lot of other conceptual things that get into more of our future planning, but don't specifically affect the 2-year budget. So one of the things I heard was funding, setting aside some funding for a Lake Del Valle reoperation study, and that the best time to bring that discussion back might be at the July planning workshop, and perhaps at that time, depending on what decision the board as a whole makes, we would consider an amendment to the budget rather than trying to pre-plan what those dollars in between now and June without the benefit of that full board discussion. So I didn't necessarily hear a request for a specific adjustment between now and the June board meeting, but more to come on that topic in the future. Mr. Stevenson also referenced a small cost adjustment to one CIP project, and so that $60,000 change will be reflected in what we bring to the board in June. But those are the only specific things that I heard in my notes where there could be some adjustments to the budget. There's certainly some other things, some other information that will be brought back. But is there anything I'm missing? Any other changes or adjustments to your budget?
Well, I would just add one thing. The focus of this presentation was pretty much on engineering our CIP, but I was kind of curious about some other areas in the district, in particular, how we plan on spending money during the budget period, let's say on communications, public relations, things like that. And how are we planning differently than how we've spent money in the past? Are there any new ideas or things that we want to do in outreach to the community? I'd like some clarity on that so that we are looking at all the creative ways that we can engage with the community around here. So I would appreciate, something, a short synopsis on that subject.
Sure. We can bring a little more granularity on those efforts to the board at the June meeting, for sure.
And I heard about some potential outreach to the elementary schools, like we had under Frank John, or...
So we've developed like a 2-year looking forward plan on public outreach. It has some sort of optional activities, but we can review with the board what our assumptions are, where we're going. We're down one staff person in that area, and be happy to discuss that with the board in June. And, largely it's an expense-related item, capital, as you know. So we do have flexibility in how we allocate funds, a little more so than capital plan. So yeah, we'll bring that back, and if there's any adjustments based on what the board hears, I'm sure those adjustments won't be large enough that it makes the budget a read.
I would like to say, think out of the box, think creatively. What are some, really cool things that we can do?
Great. Point noted. Thank you.
Okay.
I think that's it. No more comments? Okay, then that's finish up with item 5. Let's move on.
If I could just
go ahead.
very quickly. So I think there was good enough comfort level with the budget that's been presented that we're not going to plan on bringing any budget-related items to the May 29th workshop, and we'll be able to focus that workshop just on the AMI project. And so we'll bring all this back to the board June 13th for budget adoption, and along with budget adoption, some small revisions to the reserve policy that will be discussed with Finance Committee next week, and we'll also make a benchmarking presentation at the June board meeting. So just wanted to make sure we captured those upcoming dates, and that's all I have for the budget workshop.
Thank you. Any comments from the board? No? Member of the public? Do we have any comments on item 5?
Questions?
No? Questions? No, thank you. Then let's move on to General Manager's report.
Yes, thank you, President Huang. I do have a couple of items that I'd like to inform the board about briefly. The first item is that the California Water Code requires that the State Water Board, State Water Resources Control Board, develop water loss performance standards for urban retail water suppliers between January 2019 and July 2020. And additionally, the State Board is required to evaluate the life cycle cost of achieving these standards. And the reason why this is a requirement of the State Board is the state has received a lot of pressure from mostly the environmental community that water systems apparently lose, 5% or 8% of their water, or at least it's unaccounted for, not metered. And if you look at it from a macro level, gosh, you could say, well, gee, the state doesn't need to develop any more water supplies. All we have to do is fix these so-called leaks, which may or may not be leaks. So there was legislation passed that requires the State Board to require agencies like ACWD to potentially do a lot more reporting and ultimately meet performance standards for unaccounted for water. So the Resources Control Board has been working on this, and they held 4 public stakeholder workshops this year, and the 5th is scheduled for June 7th in Sacramento. They have very smart people at the State Board, and the concern is they'll come up with a way to accurately measure this that is just a horror show for agencies to report on. So the water community has been closely monitoring this. And the State Board needs to complete a lot of additional work to provide specifics on how they will determine what those performance standards are. Remember, there's an economic aspect of this because if it is water main leaks, there's a cost associated with fixing those. So there's acceptable water losses, appropriate control measures, because then if you're out of compliance, then are we going to get into a situation where the State Board is now requiring you to do water main replacements? We, ACWD, are waiting to see those details, but we have been following the State Board's sort of public and I'd call it collaborative process. Yet it does provide some sort of trepidation because you can kind of see where they're going. So Aqua has also been following this, and they prepared a coalition letter on what the framework would be. And in summary, Aqua's letter requests that the State Board address 3 main points. Have a streamlined performance standard. In other words, try to make this as simple as possible for a period of time until you get some data before you make it perfect. Provide details of the economic model in advance if you're going to do this kind of stuff, or come up with some sort of economic model that's going to have a big impact on potentially huge costs for water agencies like ACWD. It'd be great if we saw that in advance. And then technical assistance and training, especially to smaller water agencies that may not have the resources to do this. Director Sethy, thank you very much, made me aware yesterday that Aqua is asking member agencies to sign on to their letter. I was thrilled that staff has been following this issue and they were able to quickly kind of get back to me and explain where everything is. and today I authorized ACWD to be a signatory on the coalition letter because I think the assessment of staff, Leonard Ash, Thomas Nizer, is that Stephanie Evans, is that the requests that Aqua are making are reasonable. So, you know, the concern is sometimes Aqua comes out with like sort of a whiny letter, so we don't want to necessarily sign one of those. So it's not a good look for us. So I wanted to let the board know that I authorized that today, and we will be a signatory on the letter. The other interesting news, again from this morning, was that I was notified by our Sacramento representative, Jonathan Clay, of JGC Associates, that Senate Budget Subcommittee number 2 would be reviewing portions of the governor's proposed budget today. And Senator Wachowski is on that committee. So the committee considered the following today in terms of the water tax issue. And that is the recommendation of committee staff to the committee was to reject the governor's proposed water tax and other related ag fees like dairy and fertilizer taxes, and instead appropriate $150 million from the general fund to be allocated each fiscal year to address the water accessibility and affordability issues that the governor's proposed budget intends to address. And essentially what that is the O&M related costs for mostly disadvantaged communities to meet water quality and water supply reliability standards in places like the Central Valley and other areas of the state. The goals of what the O&M standards should be were outlined in SB 200, Senate Bill 200, which was a modeling bill. So basically what the committee was looking at today was, hey, forget this water tax thing, and let's just have the state appropriate $150 million on an annual recurring basis to be reevaluated every year. So we'll have to see how that goes. There's a couple of other major provisions of that, what the committee actually approved today, almost unanimously. So the amount continuously appropriated shall be reduced by an amount equivalent to any new fees, taxes, or other revenues enacted into law to fund the safe and affordable drinking water fund. So if there is a water tax, the hit on the general fund goes down. But there's no, but they're recommending to reject the water tax. But there's other legislation out there proposing a water tax. And these provisions would only become operative, this is what the committee considered today, if Senate Bill number 200 passes and takes effect, which makes sense because they're intended to be linked. So didn't have much time to look at this today, but Jonathan Clay sent me the packet that the committee was considering. They convened at 10:30 a.m., been in communication. I quickly informed Mr. Clay that if given an opportunity, he should testify at the committee hearing, which he was willing to do, with the following position. And that would be ACWD supports this approach because I think it's consistent with the direction I've received from the board. Of course, contingent on whatever the final language of SB 200 is. And the committee meeting, I mean, they had a pretty, voluminous packet to go through, was pretty much concluded within a half hour, approving everything, and including this item. So I think that's good news. Obviously, it's also going to be contingent on what the governor thinks about this. Mr. Wachowski, Mr. Clay did not have a chance to communicate directly with Mr. Wachowski because the committee took no public testimony. It was just bang bang. So I thought that was something that the board would like to hear. Apparently the California State Senate doesn't entirely have the internal fortitude to implement a tax on water at this time. So with that...
Could I bring up a few added points there?
Sure.
Okay. So, the Government Affairs Committee for the Chamber of Commerce, we have a handful of people that are meeting with Bob Wachowski at his office here in Fremont on Friday. So, in prepping for that meeting on the issues that we want to bring up, I was working with Jonathan, Clay, and Bob, and this behind the scenes, Jonathan has been talking to legislators, Aqua. We were talking to Aqua folks last week again, like Cindy Tuck and Dave Boland, others that were kind of spreading the word about the internet tax being contributed to the proposal that I had made. It's going into the general fund. Half of it goes to education right away. There are a couple other claims on the remaining funds, but the suggestion that I put forward was put in $150 a year, cap it, and then reevaluate it at a future point. And Jonathan was communicating to me, it looks like they crafted that in there in some way because that became the new source of funding for looking at this. So I'm glad that we were kind of playing a role behind the scenes. Number two, at Aqua, and I don't know if you caught onto it, but there was discussion about a Senate bill by Nancy Skinner called SB 330, and it would put a freeze on all capacity and connection charges for developers for the next decade. So the water districts would have to freeze their charges. So we're going to talk to Bob about that on Friday. I'm very much opposed personally. I can't see that anybody here at our district would be in favor, right? And Skinner is doing this, Senator Skinner, with the view that this would help out toward development of more affordable housing by reducing developer charges. But the converse of that is that they could just take this in as extra profit instead of passing on the discount to the end user or the end purchaser. So we should have an interesting discussion with Bob on Friday at lunch.
And one of the things, and by the way, I think we're in director's comments now.
Yes, we are.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I think might be an issue is that ACWD has done, I think, a pretty good job in terms of separating ourselves from the concerns about all the development in the community, because our policies are based on growth paying for itself. So you start getting away from that policy if connection charges are curtailed artificially, so that growth is now being subsidized by existing ratepayers. So anyway, thank you.
And Jonathan sent us the email saying it's moving ahead in the legislative chambers.
Right.
That there's no opposition to it.
Right.
So I think that we ought to really pay attention to that.
CSDA is ramping up to take opposition. So
How about Aqua?
I haven't heard anything.
Okay.
Okay.
Any comments, Director Akbari? Director Sethy, do you have any additional comments?
No.
Since I will be missing the June board meeting, I was wondering, can I take this opportunity to report back on my Aqua? Or would you prefer I wait till July?
Have to do it at a regular board meeting.
Is it a regular board meeting? Then I can wait till July,
Yeah.
no worries.
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
So district policy is the first regular board meeting following the conference, but
Okay.
since you won't be here,
I'll wait till July.
you can wait till July.
That's perfectly fine.
Yeah, we
I'm
would
not
only
still on my phone.
here.
Gina will remember. Okay, with that, no more comments. I will call the meeting adjourned. Thank you.